Good morning, everybody. This is Cricket Liu. I'm the Chief Infrastructure Officer for Infoblox, and I'll be delivering the presentation this morning. If any of you out there know what a Chief Infrastructure Officer does, please email me after the presentation because I honestly have no idea. So we're going to spend about 45 minutes or 55 minutes talking about DNS-based distributed denial of service attacks. These have been much in the news lately, so hopefully this will be timely information for you. And a couple of housekeeping notes. We're certainly happy to give you all copies of the presentation after the fact. Since we got your email address when you registered, we will email out a link from which you can download the presentation. As for questions, if you wouldn't mind putting your questions in the chat pod within WebEx's interface, I can try to take as many of them as possible while I'm going through the presentation. And then at the end, I'll try to clear out any that we haven't gotten to. If there are some that we don't get to at all because of time constraints, we'll answer those offline and post them. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is what you'll learn today, or you'll get your hard-earned money back. We're going to talk about what a DNS-based distributed denial of service attack is. We're going to talk about why you should worry about them, because some of these are pretty potent attacks. And then we're going to talk about what in particular you should worry about, because for DNS administrators, there are really two sides to DNS-based distributed denial of service attacks, two possible ways in which you can be either a victim or an accomplice. And then finally, we'll go through a list of means that you can use to defend yourself against these distributed denial of service attacks through augmenting your infrastructure, reconfiguring your name servers, taking advantage of other devices that might be on the path between the internet and your name servers. So unfortunately, DDoS attacks are kind of twice the threat to DNS. DDoS attacks both target name servers, and DDoS attacks use name servers increasingly. And people conduct DDoS attacks for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes they do it for extortionate reasons. They're trying to bully your company into ponying up some money. Typically, this is something that's done by organized crime. They might do it for ideological reasons because they don't like you, they don't like the business that you're in. They may do it for any number of reasons. So when we say DDoS attacks target name servers, what we mean is that folks see external name servers, particularly external authoritative name servers, as a critical resource. They are absolutely key to maintaining your presence on the internet. Without them, your customers can't get to your website, they can't send you electronic mail, they can't reach really any resources that you might make available to the internet. Moreover, your external authoritative name servers are really easy to find. You can't hide them. I have to be able to look up NS records for your zones and find your external authoritative name servers, or I can't look up your data. So one simple dig command, like the one that you see towards the bottom of the slide, dig ns company.example, will give me the names of all of your authoritative name servers, and one more query per name server will give me their IPv4 addresses. If we want to be thorough, we can also send another query and look up their IPv6 addresses. A recent attack that Prolexic described, Prolexic is a big DDoS security provider, I guess. They help combat DDoS attacks, was 25 gigabits per second against their external authoritative name servers. And that's actually pretty paltry. You'll see that they actually get much, much bigger than that. So DDoS attacks also use name servers. And why do they do that? Well, it turns out that name servers make surprisingly good amplifiers. Not the amplifier, not the kind of amplifier you see at the bottom of the slide here, although I thought it was amusing that this one had a little dymo tape over the loudness knob that enabled it to go to 11. I thought that was impressive, a nice bit of jury rigging. But the kind of amplifier that amplifies traffic. So what happens is that in a big DDoS attack in which name servers are used for amplification, you have a resolver like the one down in the lower left of this slide using open recursive name servers around the internet to fire off recursive queries. Now, for every query that's sent, obviously there's a response that's sent back. The resolver, however, is sending the queries not from its own IP address, but it's spoofing the IP address of some target out there on the internet. So that target might be a web server, it might be a name server, it might be a router, it could be just about anything. Now, as we show it here on this particular slide, this isn't a very effective attack. For every one query you get sent, the open recursive name server sends a response, a single response back to the target. So we're going to look for queries that generate really large responses, one in which we get some traffic amplification. So for a very small query, we're looking for a very large response so that we can get some leverage over the queries that we send to these open recursive name servers. And just in case you've never heard the term, an open recursive name server is just one that allows recursive queries from any old IP address out on the internet. So let's take a look at one of those queries. Here's one, a query for any records, any type of records attached to isc.org, which ironically is the Internet Systems Consortium's domain name, and those are the guys who write bind, will result in a 3,285 or 84 byte response. So for every 36 bytes that you send, you get basically 3,300 bytes in reply, and that's about a 91x amplification factor. That's enormous. If we do a little bit of math with that, you'll see that, for example, if you have, a botnet at your command, and each one of those bots has, conservatively speaking, a megabit per second connection to the internet, then you can send about 28,000 queries per second, that is 36 byte queries per second, over that connection. And that'll generate, in turn, 28,000 times 3,300 bytes in response. That's about 700 megabits per second. So every 14 bots that you have under your control will equal about 10 gigabits per second. That's an enormous amplification factor. And the great thing for you as a hacker is that you've just taken advantage of all the bandwidth that those open recursive name servers have to the internet. You don't even really have to use your own bandwidth. You're using your botnet's rather meager connections to the open recursive name servers. The open recursive name servers handle the heavy lifting of pumping all that traffic to the target. So this is a 10 gigabit per second DDoS attack. Actually, not particularly large by modern standards. So let's talk about these open recursive name servers. Some people have asked, well, are these open recursive name servers hard to find? Maybe it's difficult to find these amplifiers out there on the internet, so we don't really have to worry too much about the threat. Well, I think about these open recursive name servers as a little bit like all the AK-47s that the Soviets left after they pulled out of southwestern Asia, right? They're just out there waiting to be used for no good, and there are tons and tons of them. The Open Resolver project, which maps out the IP addresses of these open recursive name servers, you can see at the bottom of the slide, collected a list of 33 million open recursive name servers out on the internet as of last month. That is an enormous, enormous number. And of course, if you were to be able to use any significant fraction of those, you could mount an absolutely devastating DDoS attack. So why should you worry about these DDoS attacks? Well, in addition to the magnitude, they're increasing in frequency. You can see that the average attack bandwidth, according to Prolexic, is up between the fourth quarter of 2012 and the first quarter of 2013. So in a 3-month period, up 718% to 48 gigabits per second. And the average attack packet rate, which is also really important if you're dealing with, for example, routers that might be overwhelmed by packet rate rather than bandwidth, is 32.4 megapackets per second, 32 million packets per second. The average attack duration quarter over quarter is up 7% to 34.5 hours. And of the DDoS attacks that we see out on the internet, 7% of them were DNS based. That's a 200% increase in the last year. So not all of these DDoS attacks are DNS based, but that's a healthy percentage of them. So we need to be very cautious about configuring our name servers to make sure that they can't be used in attacks against other people. So what can you do to protect yourself from these DNS-based DDoS attacks? Well, there are four things that came immediately to mind to me. One is over-provision. Another is to use Anycast, which we'll talk about in upcoming slides. You can screen traffic to your name servers using existing devices. And then finally, you should always monitor traffic to your name servers so that you can easily identify a DDoS attack and take corrective action. So what do we mean by over-provisioning? I know this seems kind of primitive, but basically we mean have a lot of capacity out there in your external authoritative name servers, much more than you actually need. If your average query rate is in the thousands of queries per second, maybe you still want to have name servers that are capable of going up to hundreds of thousands of queries per second. It all depends on how important your external presence on the internet is to you. If you're an electronic commerce company, if your external web presence is really valuable to you, then a little extra investment in that external authoritative infrastructure won't cost you much, but it'll give you a lot of peace of mind. Right. So that's the first part of over-provisioning. You can also run a widely distributed set of authoritative name servers. You definitely don't want to be in a position where you have a single point of failure or a single bottleneck in your external authoritative infrastructure. Microsoft found out about that the hard way back in the bad old days. They put all four of their authoritative name servers for Microsoft.com and Expedia.com, which they then owned, and a lot of other web properties on the same wire up in Redmond, Washington, and then somebody misconfigured their border router and cut them off from the internet. Right? That's an accidental DOS attack, but you certainly don't want to make things any easier on an attacker by having, for example, all of your external authoritative name servers on the same wire or behind the same circuit or behind the same border router or the same firewall. So by distributing your authoritative name servers behind multiple connection points to the internet, behind multiple firewalls and multiple border routers, you're going to make things much more difficult on a would-be attacker. And then another option is that you can augment your authoritative name servers with cloud-based secondary name servers. There are a lot of good providers out there who run big Anycast clouds of authoritative name servers. Dyn Inc., based up in Manchester, New Hampshire, is an example of this. Out here in the Bay Area, there's Newstar. These guys will augment your infrastructure. You can keep control over your zone data, run your own primary name server, run some of your own secondary name servers, but have Dyn or Newstar operate secondaries for your zones. That way, if you get attacked, their infrastructure will absorb some of those queries. Now, we just mentioned Anycast in the context of these cloud-based providers. Anycast is a pretty useful tool in combating DDoS attacks. It's sort of incidental to Anycast's original purpose, though. Anycast is basically a configuration technique that allows multiple distributed name servers, or servers in general, to share a single virtual IP address. It's something that we've used on the internet for years and years and years with the root name servers, because in the original 512-byte DNS message, we couldn't fit more than 13 root name servers and their 13 IPv4 addresses. So we ended up creating many, many replicas of each of those name servers with the same IP address and distributing those across the globe. The way that works is that each name server advertises a route that to its virtual IP address to its neighbors. So it's running a small routing process, maybe that's Zebra or Quagga or something like that, and it's saying, hey, I have a route to this little virtual IP address. If you need to get to that IP address, come to me. Queries then that are sent to that address are routed by the internet's routing infrastructure to whichever instance of that name server is the closest. So we can look at that diagrammatically. If you have a client over here on the far left side of the slide, and it's meaning to talk to the virtual IP address 10.0.0.1, you can see that in this case, there are two instances of 10.0.0.1. There's server instance A in the upper right of the slide and server instance B, which is at the lower right of the slide. Both of those server instances are running routing processes. They're advertising the availability of that virtual IP address to their two neighbor routers, router 2 and router 4, and router 2 and router 4 are in turn talking to router 1 and router 3. It's like the old shampoo commercial. And eventually all this routing information reaches router 1. The client, when it has that DNS query to send to 10.0.0.1, ends up sending that to router 1, its default router, and router 1 checks its routing table, which you can see at the bottom of the slide, which shows two routes to 10.0.0.1. One, the route to server instance A, is shorter, right? It has only one more router on that path, so that's probably the one that it'll choose, and it ends up routing the packet in that direction. Now, the client actually has no idea that there are really two servers on the back end, or in the case of root name servers, dozens of servers on the back end. It simply knows that its query got to the right place and it eventually gets a response. So the next question to ask, I guess, is how does this actually help us address DDoS attacks? If we use Anycast, well, the nice thing about Anycast is that from any one location on the internet, you can only see, and therefore you can only attack, a single replica in the Anycast group at any one time. So, for example, if you source a big DDoS attack out of China, mainland China, for example, and you're leveling that at one of the root name servers like f.root-servers.net, you'll only be able to attack probably one instance of f, the one that might be, say, in Shanghai or Beijing or Hong Kong or something like that. All of the routes to that particular virtual IP address will point to that closest replica. Only if you manage to take out that closest replica of F would you be able to attack, from China anyway, the next closest instance of F. And then, of course, once the traffic shunted over to that next closest instance, presumably the closest instance would recover because it would no longer be under such heavy attack. So this is a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole. You manage to take out one instance, you move on to the next instance, and the original instance pops back up. So the same mechanism can be used for your external authoritative name servers. It's used very commonly by cloud-based DNS providers, and it provides good resistance to those DDoS attacks. Screen traffic to your name servers. Well, this is always a good idea. You've always got to have an internet firewall between your external authoritative name servers and the internet. You've got to have a border router between your external authoritative name servers and the internet. And these days, any modern router, any modern internet firewall is going to have some anti-DDoS facilities, and you may as well take advantage of these. They can probably do SYN flood mitigation by rate limiting SYN frames. They can probably do some router traffic shaping, and you may as well avail yourself of that. Your load balancers might also have some of the same functionality. I think I mentioned them in the slide, but I didn't mention them audibly before now. And then finally, you should monitor traffic to your name servers so that you know when your name servers are actually under attack. So there are a number of different things that you can monitor. One of those is aggregate query rate. If you've been administering your name servers for some time and monitoring them for some time, you've probably built an understanding of what your average query rate looks like. And so you'll identify spikes. If your query rate jumps up to 100 times the norm, then that's probably indicative that you're under some sort of attack, or that, you know, your company's having a big sale, I guess. And then you should also take a look at the top queriers. Now, you might want to use aggregate query rate as a trigger of sorts to cause you to look more closely at the data and at, for example, the top queriers, and see if there's a particular querier that's really hammering your external authoritative name servers. So I realize this is a little bit commercial, but I copped some screenshots from Infoblox's NIOS product to give you an idea of what this might look like. This is part of our reporting facility. And you can see here a graph. This is a stacked graph of aggregate query rate on 4 name servers in a particular Infoblox grid. And you can see the one that's getting the majority of the queries is this one called demogm1.infoblox.com. Now, the nice thing is that you can actually set an alert on aggregate query rate. So if you wanted to, you could say, as you see on this slide here, I want to set a critical alert, and it's going to say, help, we're under attack, if I ever get this alert. And I'm going to send an SNMP trap, and I'm going to log something to syslog if, and the alert expression is down here at the bottom, if my queries per second ever exceed 100,000 queries per second. And of course, you can tailor that to whatever you want to. You can make this specific to a particular member. If, for example, you know that one of your members is usually busier than the others, and so it ought to have a higher threshold for creating that alert, you can make that higher and so on. Now, this doesn't have to be done with Infoblox's NIOS. You can probably do this with other name servers as well. I just wanted to give you an example of what this might look like. So on the next slide, you'll see a graph also available within our reporting facility that shows top clients. And I thought this was really interesting. I just happened to catch our demo grid at a time when one particular querier was sending the vast majority of the queries. But I thought this actually is exactly the sort of thing that you'd look for. If you were being used in a DDoS attack against somebody else, you probably would see that the vast majority of your queries appeared to be coming from the IP address that was actually being targeted, right? So someone's spoofing queries from that IP address. That's soaking up a bunch of your overall query capacity, and you're responding over and over and over to that IP address. So this particular example might indicate that you were an accomplice to a DDoS attack against the guy at 192.168. I can't quite read it, .1.100, because he seems to be soaking up over 90% of your inbound queries. So I said that really we're talking about two different threats with DNS-based DDoS attacks. Half of the problem is that you can actually be a victim. Your external authoritative name servers can be a victim of a big DDoS attack out on the internet. But the other half of the problem is that you can be part of the problem. You can be an accomplice in a DDoS attack against others. And we just saw within the reporting facility of NIOS that you can help to identify when you're being used as an amplifier in a DDoS attack. But there are some other measures that you should probably take. And one of those is very simple. It's just ingress filtering. Ingress filtering is making sure that on your border router, the router that connects you to the rest of the internet, if you see a packet, an IP packet coming from the far end of that border router, the source IP address on that packet had better not be one of your internal IP addresses, right? All of your internal IP addresses had better be on the near side of that WAN connection. And likewise, anything that leaves your network ought to leave from one of your internal IP addresses, not from some random IP address. I mean, it seems like a kind of motherhood and apple pie sort of measure, but it is really, really important because this preventive measure makes it possible for you to apply access controls on, for example, your internet-facing recursive name servers that say, I only accept queries on my recursive name servers if they come from my internal IP addresses. And then you have a real black and white, hard and fast distinction between what's internal and what's external. And there's no way for somebody out there on the internet to spoof one of your internal IP addresses and induce one of your recursive name servers to attack somebody. And that leads us to number two, right? Applying access control lists to your recursive name servers. As I said before, open recursive name servers are one of the scourges of the internet. Don't be a person who runs open recursive name servers. If you have name servers out on your DMZs that run recursion, make sure that they do not allow recursive queries from just any old IP address. That is part of your responsibility as a good internet citizen. They have to have access control lists applied to them. So if you're doing ingress filtering, you can easily apply an ACL that says only allow queries if they come from my internal IP address ranges. And then finally, a newer technique is to rate limit traffic or responses from your name servers. And I have some examples of this. A couple of very, very bright guys over at ISC. Actually, I don't know if Vern Shriver is technically working for ISC, but Paul certainly is now. Anyway, Paul Vixie and Vernon Shriver came up with a pretty clever patch for Bind to help rate limit traffic, and in particular, to make sure that the same queriers can't ask you the same questions over and over and over again too frequently, right? So this is known as response rate limiting, or RRL, and response rate limiting is available as patches to the later versions of Bind, I believe from Bind 9.8 on. you can download and apply RRL patches. And you apply these to your authoritative name servers, and basically what it causes those authoritative name servers to do is to track how many times queryers ask them for certain responses. And it will prevent them from sending the same response to the same client too frequently. There are also implementations of RRL now in a couple of other name servers, more than just Bind. NSD, which comes out of NLNet Labs, and NOT, which is an increasingly popular name server, both have implementations of RRL. And if you're interested in the patches, if you're interested in more information about RRL, you can see the URL down there at the bottom of the slide. So the way that RRL works, and unfortunately this previously animated slide is not going to be very interesting to you because it's no longer animated, is that when you have some querier, like the one down at the bottom left of the slide, send a query to the authoritative name server up there at the kind of the middle, let's say middle left, and it'll induce some response. There's a token bucket associated with that particular response and with that particular querier. That means that there are literally thousands and thousands of token buckets associated with each authoritative name server, because it's tracking all kinds of different responses and all kinds of different responses to all kinds of different queriers. Anytime we send that response to a querier, we are going to remove a token from that token bucket. And if that token bucket dries up, if it goes completely empty, then we're going to stop sending responses to the querier. Now, that's normally okay because, you know, if it's a real querier, he will have gotten the response and he doesn't need to get the response again for a little while. And we're actually refilling the token bucket at some prescribed rate. We're putting more tokens into it, kind of like an allowance. You know, maybe we're putting 5 tokens in it per second. So if you ask more than 5 times a second from the same IP address for the same response, you're going to get squelched, right? We're going to start suppressing those queries. So this is a very, very nice mechanism to use to inhibit DDoS attacks that use your authoritative name servers. It's very, very handy. There's even another very handy, very clever, in my opinion, wrinkle to this. I think Vernon and Paul realized that it would be possible for an attacker to deplete the token bucket of a legitimate querier. For example, I could masquerade as one of Infoblox's recursive name servers, and I could use up the token bucket for that IP address on the ISC.org authoritative name servers, just by sending a lot of queries moved from Infoblox's IP addresses to the ISC.org authoritative name servers. And then Infoblox would never be able to talk to ISC.org. Well, Vernon and Paul came up with this idea that randomly, after the token, even if the token bucket is empty, the authoritative name server will send a response that is deliberately truncated. It's a very small response. It has the truncation bit set in the header, and it'll send that back to the querier. Now, if you're really only under attack, the attacker will actually never see that response, right? That'll be sent to the target, but that's okay because it's actually not much amplification. It's a small response. It's deliberately truncated. On the other hand, if you're in Infoblox's situation and you're a real querier and you've had your token bucket starved by somebody else, you would see that truncated response. And when you got that truncated response, you'd simply retry over TCP, and that presumably would succeed. So you've still got the ability to get responses from an authoritative name server, even if it's being abused by somebody out there on the internet. So that's really good news. So that's all I had for our normal sort of presentation, but it looks like we got some questions while I was talking, which is fantastic. So a couple of answers. To Nick, will this session be recorded, please? The answer is yes, we are recording it, and it will be available for viewing later. So if you think that there's anything worthwhile in here and you want to pass along the link to a coworker, or if you missed the beginning of the presentation and want to come back, you'll be able to see that. We'll send out information on that. Anders Nilsson says, what's your opinion on DNSSEC generating even more DDoS amplification, and how do we resolve that? Well, it's certainly true that DNSSEC signed zones give you larger responses. There's just so much overhead in terms of DNS key records and RSIG records and all the rest. On the other hand, that's not the only way to get amplification from DNS. You could easily plug in big text records too, or sync records, or SRV records, or any number of other things. So unfortunately, I think that's just sort of the price of deploying DNSSEC, and mechanisms like response rate limiting help us to a degree to mitigate the kind of damage that a DNSSEC signed zone can do. Joseph asked, will we be able to request these slides at the end of the presentation? And certainly you can request them all you want. No, we're happy to give you soft copies of the slides. What we'll probably do is we'll send out a message to everyone who registered with a link, and you'll be able to go to that link to download copies of the slides. Vinesh says, we recently had a DDoS attack on our DNS servers, and we have our next-gen firewall with an IPS, with IPS functionality, I guess, in front of the DNS, but during the attack, the UDP sessions were high, and the firewall session table was saturated and blocked all traffic. So, how would the info-blocks help? And I guess if we're behind the firewall, we really can't help you, because if the firewall failed because the session table was saturated, there's really nothing that we could do there. That sounds like a fundamental limitation in the firewall that would have to be addressed for us to even see the traffic. So I'm afraid, Vinesh, that your firewall limitations will have to be addressed before we can help you. And then Vinny Perez says, is RRL available on Infoblox? And he says, if so, what version? Well, that's a really good question, and unfortunately I have to be very cautious about answering it. Right now, we do not support RRL, but of course we're very interested in RRL and committed to making sure that you can safely use our appliances on your networks, and that that our customers are not abused or used to abet hackers. So I would say we're interested in that, and watch the space for further news. Let's see. Steve Moss asked a question about his domain names being registered with Network Solutions and using their advanced DNS capabilities for his DNS records, and asked what is his level of risk in doing it this way. Unfortunately, I don't know what Network Solutions' advanced DNS capabilities are, so I don't really feel qualified to answer that. But Steve, if you want to follow up with me directly via email, please feel free to send me email directly at cricket@infoblox.com. Let's see, and Eric says, screening and load balancing are the opposite of what one needs to do to protect against DDoS. The devices between the attacker and the name servers are more of a point of failure than multiple name servers working together via IBGP or OSPF ECMP. All right. Are there any, Walter asks, are there any recommendations on how to avoid becoming a target? I guess keep your head down. I think some organizations are just naturally going to be targeted because of what they do. If you work for a company that does work for the DoD, if you work for an arm of the federal government, I think you're just going to be a magnet for certain types of attacks. If you're a company that's doing well, you may be a magnet for attacks by people looking to extort money from you. So, it's really something that's probably outside of your control and is really inherent in the kind of work that your organization does. Let's see. Steve says, what are the advantages or disadvantages of using something like RRL as opposed to limiting the traffic outside of the bind process itself? Well, that's a good question. Certainly you could implement RRL-like features outside of bind. We've looked at that and are pretty interested in it. Sometimes, bind has better visibility into what's going on because it can actually look at the responses that it's sent and the queries that it's seen, but that could also be done by an external process. It could also be done perhaps by some sort of hardware accelerator. Jason Olson says, are there any clearly defined or published relationships between Infoblox and cloud-based DNS providers? That's an interesting question. I don't know that there really are. I certainly have close relationships to Dyn, the company. Infoblox has has close relationships to Newstar, but I'm not sure about published relationships. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Eric says, "Don't host Spam House." Yeah, Spam House was rumored to have been the subject of well, they were definitely the subject of a big DDoS attack. It was rumored to have hit 300 gigabits per second, which was, I mean, if it really did hit 300 gigabits per second, that would be remarkable. Walter says, "Are there any known methods to trace attackers when botnets are being used? Is the only option to try and turn to law enforcement?" That's a good question. You know, I think one of the problems is that when somebody's using a DDoS or a, excuse me, a botnet to attack you in a big DDoS attack, it's so easy to spoof the source IP address in DNS because it's UDP based and it's connectionless. So you're effectively just stamping a source IP address on the packet and sending it into the wild. You'd have to be able to sort of trace hop by hop all the way back to the source, which, you know, would go through so many different organizations and so many different legal jurisdictions that it would seem to be almost, you know, unsolvable, I would say. And let's see, there are a few things that came in directly via chat. Syed Ghani said, "Would limiting query types help, especially in combination with ingress IP ACLs?" That's certainly one possibility. You know, one of the things that various people have floated is the idea of suppressing type any queries or responses to type any queries. There aren't a lot of legitimate queriers out there for type any queries. And so, you know, if you did squelch those, you probably wouldn't harm too many people. There wouldn't be too much collateral damage, but you'd probably be able to suppress some of the larger responses that your name server would send. However, you could probably still get a very large response just by looking up DNS key records or RSIG records or, you know, any number of other things. Let's see, what other questions do we have here? Do you need a reporting module activated on the Gridmaster to be able to get alert notifications? Yes, you do need the reporting server that we offer in order to get alerts from your reports. And let's see, Solomon asked, is the alert notification only available on NIOS 6.7? No, but it is part of the reporting server. Yeah, and that's the answer to Tom Rudnick's question as well. Are aggregate query rate and top queries reports built into the basic Gridmaster? No, that's part of the reporting server as well. All right, well, it looks like there are Eric actually mentioned something very helpful, which is it's better to use Jared Mauch's TCP fallback patch for any rather than block it. And that is quite true. That is quite true. That's exactly, it's very, very similar to the SLIP facility in RRL. Basically what that does is it says, if you send in any query, I'm going to send back a deliberately truncated response. And if you're really interested in getting the response, you can retry over TCP. So thank you, Eric. That's a great clarification there and a much better answer. Well, it looks like I've still got some questions to answer, but we're about quarter till. So I will save those to answer offline for you. Thank you guys all very, very much for your attention. Thank you for tuning in. I hope it was worthwhile. And please feel free to download copies of the slides or point anybody you want to at the recorded version of the webinar. And tune again to a webinar in the future. Thanks. Bye-bye.